Hello, my name is Olurotimi Osho. I like to talk about history and I talk about American presidents. Today is uh, about roughly over 37 days since the Iran US Israeli war started with the decapitation of the leadership of the Iranian government. That's Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Since then, there's been a lot going on, and however, today what I want to discuss is um, sort of the fallout and implications of President Trump's recent tweet. His tweet he had a tweet in which he stated that it used a lot of expletives, right? And this was on Easter Sunday, which was yesterday, right? He use the F word, effing, use the F word, um, about, which he was trying to coerce or demanding that Iranians open the Strait of Hormuz. And he used the F word, saying the effing Strait of Hormuz. And then he called Iranians crazy bastards, and then he ends it bizarrely with praise be to Allah. I don't know if that was supposed to be sarcastic or if it didn't show any sense of equanimity at all. I took courses in writing, technical communications, a long time ago when I worked for COVID Securities. I actually took it at a school, right? Technical writing. And also, when I was working in the Department of the Navy, I was also sponsored by the Department of the Navy to take a course in, writing, right? Technical writing for auditors and things like that. So there's one of the things that you do in these courses is they can present you writing like a letter or an email, formal writing, and they ask you to identify the author and the audience, right? Because every piece of writing, the medium, the message, it has an originator who has a certain intent, and of course, it's meant for an audience. So they ask you to identify the author and the their possible vocation, and of course the message and the audience. Now, if they were to present the tweet by President Trump, I guess it was on Truth Social, and they didn't tell us that it was the U.S. president, or they didn't tell us it was they didn't identify President Trump, and they just presented the message, right? No one would have guessed that the writing was from the United States president, right? Was came from a president of the United States, right? So you see, there's this growing disconnect um, with normal standards, right? There's this increasing left field behavior by the president and his cabinet, right, in the way they're engaging. And this was what uh, public figures like, the former Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's a Republican, and Candace Owens, who's a Republican, right, the influencer and reporter Candace Owens, right? Candace Owens, they were saying President Trump is crazy, right? They were, and many people have been, they've been doing a social media blitzkrieg calling for the use of the 25th Amendment against the president. The 25th Amendment, by the way, is um, it authorizes the removal of an incumbent president based on incapacity, including insanity, that the person is, non-compos mentis, that this president is insane. It's the cabinet members who have to vote. And, if the majority agree, it can actually remove an American president. This was a call, that Americans made as well uh, during the January 6th insurrection, right? When it happened in, was that 2021? And of course, so every now and then, Americans, up in arms and are clutching their pearls, talking about removing President Trump and that he's crazy. But it's the same Americans who voted President Trump in 2024. Didn't matter to them that he was going through a lot of these legal, um, going through a legal quagmire, right? He had the quandary regarding the 34 felony convictions in New York. He still had other pending cases. He was awaiting his sentencing, right? When he was elected president, he was awaiting sentencing in New York. He'd lost civil cases. Women had come claiming he raped them. This is what they allege. By the way, let me just put it out there that saying I did First Amendment, right, and it's defamatory, right, and it's actually criminal in certain states. And in our federal laws, in our constitution, under defamation law within the First Amendment, saying someone is mentally ill, has an odious mental illness when they do not, or any form of illness when they do not. It's defamatory, right? And you could be, guilty of a civil fine or civil suit. They can bring a civil suit against you, right? So, but Americans use that accusation. They throw it around regardless, right? They throw this around indiscriminatory, crazy, crazy, crazy. And I came to realize that, and it's been a long time since I realized it. In fact, since I was in Nigeria, Americans seem to have this affinity, this love, this embrace of craziness, insanity, right? You see it in our figure of speeches, right? In our figures of, I don't know, in our idiomatic expressions, right? Um, like there's a popular idiomatic expression when Americans will say, that idea is so crazy, it just might work, right? An idea is so crazy, it just might work, right? That is an irrational statement, but it's very popular, right? So Americans like crazy people. They think it's cool in popular culture, right? We associate genius, highly intelligent people in America with crazy, eccentric people. You see the scientist. The genius scientist a genius scientist is always portrayed as being insane, being crazy. So it's an American thing. In fact, in our art, right? I remember growing up in Nigeria. Lots of songs in the 90s, especially, were always songs about crazy, crazy. We use crazy as a synonym for love, right? Being in love. Like there was a popular, uh, is it The Boys, a popular boy group back then when I was growing up. The Boys, they had a song, Crazy, you got me going crazy. I'm crazy for you. All sorts of songs like that, expressing love in terms of madness, crazy, crazy. I remember when I was growing up as a kid and I was singing one of those songs, and my aunt was aghast. She was like, she was mortified that, hey, stop, stop. That's not a good song. Why are you singing that song? And I explained to her that, no, this is an American song. It's popular. She knew that. But let me explain something. While in America, Americans seem to, I don't know if it's idolize madness, embrace madness. And I guess that's one of the paradoxes, saying President Trump is crazy, getting on social media saying President Trump is crazy without realizing that Americans crazy, right? They normalize crazy. It's like a baseline, possibly because a tremendous amount of Americans are crazy. If you go to European countries, I lived and schooled in Europe, in Italy. I remember I had Italian friends who used to tell me they think Americans are crazy. They describe Americans as crazy. And Americans are proud of it. They like it. And there's a reason for it, right? We're a nation that goes to war constantly. A very substantial, not insignificant portion of our population are scarred by PTSD. PTSD is a form of, it causes, mental illness. It's a form of mental illness that is crazy. By the way, I'm going to briefly discuss how the terms changed. So we don't use insanity anymore, right? It's still used in legal terms, but in terms of medical, right, as a medical diagnosis, insanity is no longer used. In our use mental disorder, and this was since the 1950s. I'll get to that, right? Um, by the way, the reason why I'm doing all of this is I'm trying to say, hey, America, we're the most powerful nation in the world today. And, we're going to go, there'll be nations, there'll be posterity, they're going to study America. Historians, they'll study America just like historians study the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire has been gone dead for a long time now, almost a millennium, right? But we still study the Roman Empire. We still study the Greeks. The Greeks are known for their intelligence. They were highly intelligent people. And what I'm titling this is when posterity, when they study Americans, what would they call them? They'll probably call them, would they say Americans were mad people, right? They were a nation of mad people. We consider even Roman emperors, right? There's certain emperors that we just describe as mad, right? Even people who are not so familiar with Roman history. But when you mention Nero, there be people who know that name Nero, they associate him with madness. They say Nero was mad. You ask about Commodus, right, the son of Marcus Aurelius, who was portrayed in that movie Gladiator, right? When you ask who was Commodus, people will say he was crazy. When you ask about Caligula, who was he? He was crazy. So, what will historians write about Americans? Will they say Americans were very intelligent people, as they say Greeks were very intelligent? Or will they say Americans are just the mad people? They were just crazy, right? And they embraced madness, right? So, this is sort of what um, this discussion that I'm giving is mainly about. How will historians write about Americans? And it's disturbing because of the baseline Americans have accepted, right? There's a saying in the land of blind men, right? The one-eyed man is king, right? If somebody were to ask that, okay, what is the salient attributes, right, in this land relationship with the king and the people he leads, right? People would say blindness, right? The king, he's blind in one eye, right? But a common attribute he has with his people is, they're blind. People they are blind. So that's the baseline. Well, I guess a smart Alec would say they're men. That they're all men as well, right? Um, so America, our president is Donald Trump, and people are all over social media today talking about how he's crazy, he's crazy. But what about the people? What relationship does he have with the people who elected him? Right? Half of Americans elected President Donald Trump. When are we to acknowledge that maybe half of Americans are actually crazy? Like it's a baseline in America today, and nobody's really addressing this issue. We've normalized craziness, madness, right? We're normalizing madness, and we don't see madness as horrifying anymore. We don't see madness, mental illness, mental disorder. We don't see it as being horrifying. You know, you don't shrink at it. Uh, my culture, I'll say, talking about my aunt when I was growing up in Nigeria, who heard me singing an American song, right? Crazy for you, and you got me going crazy, crazy. I'm gonna look up that song. I think it was the Boys. The Boys, that was the band group that sang that song. You got me going crazy. My aunt reprimanded me when I was a kid. Hey, stop singing that song, right? And I told her it's an American song. She's like, no, it's not a good thing because unlike in America, madness, that's what they call it. They don't call it mental illness, they just call it madness. It's stigmatized. And so people who have a mental illness in Nigeria, they're identified early and they're isolated. They put them, there's like a mad people's colony, as they put it. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to stigmatize people with mental illnesses. I'm not trying to do that in America. I'm just reporting something that happens in Nigeria, right, where I'm originally from, and it still happens in many cultures. Now, this might be viewed as sort of primitive and violating the human rights of people, but I'm just trying to show you the contrast, right, and how this is problematic in America, especially with respect to our president. And people keep making accusations that, well, he's he's nuts or whatever, and but nobody's removing him. We do have the 25th Amendment to remove, an insane president, right? So my aunt, I remember she would tell me, not to sing that song because, it's expressing madness, right? And because in Nigeria, people who have mental illnesses, they don't refer to it as mental illness in Nigeria, at least as I was growing up. Even till today, at this class, they would just call it madness, right? They are isolated. They're put in a separate colony. They don't go to school, right? They're sort of like a colony, sort of, right? They are isolated, ostracized, right, from the rest of society. They don't go to school. They don't marry, and which is not good. So they don't have certain human rights. That's just like practicing eugenics in America, right? The practice of eugenics in America was very bad. Particularly, Maryland was the center of the eugenics movement in America, and that was a very bad, terrible period. It violates, human rights. Um, but reality we have to consider is how Americans have sort of embraced um, um, again, it's not called insanity anymore. I was going to say insanity. And let me talk about how the term insanity stopped being used. I think insanity stopped being used from the 1920s, and especially around 1952, when the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders um, um, stopped using the broad term insanity. And we could see it in 1921. In 1921, there was a journal called the American Journal of Insanity, right? So insanity was a more catch-all phrase, an umbrella term that was used for mental disorders in the 19th century and before that, right? But in 1921, the American Journal of Insanity became the American Journal of Psychiatry, and so it was now more common in the medical field to diagnose a specific disorder, such as so insanity was replaced with more specific disorders like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. You know, so these are very severe uh, disorders, but it's very common now for many people to say, well, they have a bipolar disorder. It's very common for people to say they have bipolar disorder now. And in the 60s, 1960s, um, there's actually a case, O'Connor versus Donaldson, but that was in 1975, and I should discuss that. This was a case that made it unlawful to institutionalize, to put anybody in a mental institution against their will, so long as they're not dangerous, right? If they're not dangerous, the law says it's illegal to confine them, right? So long as they're not dangerous, right? That's O'Connor versus Donaldson. I'll discuss the case. I'll do another video discussing the case. And prior to that, so America basically got rid of its state asylum institutions, especially with the surge, the production of antipsychotics, right? So long as people could use medication, right, and be at home and go to their jobs. And basically that's what's happening. So for instance, even if President Trump, if it were the case that President Trump actually has a mental illness, that, we don't use the term insanity anymore. So long as he has a doctor who's prescribing him medication and he's taking his medication, it's nobody's business. That's how America is right now, right? And there's a reason for that because a very huge proportion of our people have been to war, they're service people, and it's unfair to be able to for Americans to send our soldiers, our young men and women to war, which scars them. They come back with severe mental disorders, and then we should now alienate them from the rest of society. I did a video, I've discussed the movie First Blood. If you haven't watched it, you should watch it. It's a very telling movie. Great movie, but it's reality. Things that actually events like that, instances of soldiers returning, veterans who are alienated, right, from society. They're alienated and they become ostracized and stigmatized, right? They become criminalized. So Sylvester Stallone acted as John Rambo, right, a Vietnam vet, and he got into trouble with the law, and he sort of had PTSD and sort of went crazy, went berserk. So um, later on, with the use of antipsychotics, many people, many Americans, so long as they're seeing their doctors, they could use medication, they carry on as usual. And part of the 1964 Civil Rights Act was, and then ADA, it bars discrimination, right, based on a disability. And in this case, it would be a mental disorder. Again, it's not my goal to stigmatize um, people struggling or living with mental illness. But the reason I use that idiomatic expression, in the land of blind men, the one eyed man is king, is because, people keep referring to President Trump, making insinuations, suggestions that, well, he's crazy, he's displaying behavior that's crazy. Look, we have to be realistic that in America, Americans sort of have a baseline craziness, right? There's a baseline craziness. I met a nurse, a psychiatric nurse, who claims that all people in the world have bipolar disorder. Now, again, bipolar disorder is actually a form of madness. And so back then, it would be called insanity. I explained how the term insanity is now disfavored, right? It's now disfavored. They now use euphemisms instead. At least in the medical field, they now use mental disorders, and they specifically have to state what form of mental disorder it is, right? Because you could actually be sued, for instance, if it's bipolar disorder, if it's schizophrenia, or those are the new terms, at least with respect to medicine, right? Uh, Insanity is still used by the courts. It's still a legal term. Insanity, which makes our court system sort of outdated. But today, I read a study that said 40%, at least 40% of Gen Z had admit to having seen consulted a psychiatrist or a psychologist, a mental health professional, right? Gen Zs have a very short lifetime, so they're still very young. I think Gen Z are still in their 20s, right? And they're already seeing psychiatrists, and so it's, if people have a mental illness, yes, they should be able to see their professional to help. But I've met people who suffer from bipolar disorder, and they've talked to me and said, look, the medication, even though they take medication, right, for this bipolar disorder or other mental illness, schizos, it doesn't take away, doesn't cure the condition. It doesn't cure the condition. It's what it does. It sedates them, right? It sedates them like zombies, so they're not, because there are things that can happen because people have a mental illness, right? So it sedates them. It makes them sleepy, drowsy, so they don't have the energy to cause problems, right? So they sleep or whatever, right? So the person who, I saw someone who talks to, he sees something, and he's hallucinating, right? He's talking to someone who's not there. He hears voices. he takes medication all day long, but he's still, he's sedate, he's not harming anybody, but he still sees someone that nobody else sees, and he still hears someone that nobody else hears, right? And so it's sort of problematic that um, this is where we are in America, right? Um, we have a not insignificant amount of the population that normalizes crazy behavior. Now, the expletives, that President Trump wrote that were on presidential, right? What is funny is even liberals, even Democrats uh, are doing the same thing. You see, I don't know if it's probably Democrats of a certain generation, and you hear them, you know, using the F word. I saw it was a James Carville. Carville, I don't know if his first name's James, but he used to be a Clinton advisor. He's bald now. He has a podcast, and he was just using expletives, saying how he hates Donald Trump, blah blah blah. And his conduct was left field, right? And normally there's certain cultures, certain civilizations, or certain periods where he was conducting himself live to go viral, right? Because we do think everything's clickbait these days in America. Everything so long as something can make money, America's fine with it, right? There's no equanimity, no sense of decorum anymore. Just as long as it makes money. And this guy he was just using all sorts of F bombs, cursing out Trump, saying, oh, he hates him. And this was crazy. In fact, at some point, was spitting as he was talking. This was like crazy conduct. It's not normal. It's left field. Typically, one would say, hey, okay, it's like he's lost his mind, right? He's gone off the deep end because he's not controlling himself, right? Part of being sane, being stable, is you have the ability to comport yourself in public, right? You don't give in to your impulse, right? People who have disorders or insanity, let me go back to insanity back then. They had not only they had a lost grasp of reality, right? And they couldn't control their impulses, and they were irrational. Obviously, made them irrational. This morning I read the response of the Iranian foreign ministry spokesman to the 15 point requirement for a ceasefire, which had been passed by the Pakistani mediators onto the Iranians, and he called it illogical, right? Illogical. So this is how Americans, the leadership of America, is increasingly being viewed as illogical. Even the actions, even the decapitation, the assassination of an incumbent president. By the way, Ali Khamenei, I don't glorify him. I don't have to be giving these disclaimers about not glorifying him or not admiring him or whatever. The thing is, though, there's a group of people who admired him, and he was a leader of a nation. And he was actually also a religious leader, not just to his nation, but to several other nations. You can imagine someone assassinating the Pope just because they've taken up the cudgels against him, and somebody just assassinating, or a foreign head of state just assassinating him, like the whole Vatican. You can imagine the sort of outrage that would stir in the world. What makes it um, acceptable? Because the assassinated uh, government uh, are Muslims. So these are just crazy things that are left field. They're they're over the top. They're beyond the pale. They're just they're not things that reasonable, rational people do, right? So that's why I was thinking, how will historians view Americans, right, from the lens of perspective of how our leaders acted, or even what the nation would tolerate, would accept. Um, I'm going to continue this in another video, and I'm going to use some analogies. I don't want to make this video too long, and so I wanted to discuss um, uh, The Emperor um, Has No Clothes by uh, Hans Christian Andersen. It's a Danish 19th century folk tale written by Hans Christian Andersen. And I also wanted to talk a little bit before, but let me end this with um, the story of Jonathan Swift, right? Jonathan Swift, many of us know him from Gulliver's Travels. I've read several of his works, and of course, he wrote Gulliver's Travels. He coined a lot of phrases, one of them being Yahoo, the famous Yahoo uh, web browser is derives its name from a word coined by Jonathan Swift. Yahoo actually means crazy. It symbolizes savage, wild, crazy. So Yahoos were in his book, famous book, Gulliver's Travels. He coined Lilliputian, right? We know Lilliputian coined Brobdingnagian. So he coined so many words for us in the English language. However, what I was going to bring out was that Jonathan Swift, close to the end of his life, was declared incompetent. Right, his friends had to declare him that he was of unsound mind and memory. And Americans are living longer today, and with the use of medication, I think many people who are senior citizens, they're masking or getting past uh, the fact that they might be struggling with senile dementia. I'm not an ageist, I'm just discussing reality, especially since I was a victim of an octogenarian, Jide Wari, an insane man. My family thinks he's insane. That's Jide Wari. We don't know if it's from dementia, but he just wrote some fabrications, and I've been a victim of these fabrications, false emergency evaluation petition, since the past 3 years now. The judge who was presiding over this, Judge James Bonifant, just retired in March. My friends came to observe him. He told bizarre, blatant lies in court about me. He was crazy. The way he lacked judicial temperament, he would raise his voice and shout, make all sorts of fabrications. He would lie, and my friends were convinced he was crazy. Right? He was megalomaniacal, and we're seeing these things. Older people still working, so we don't know if they're masking their senility, their dementia. And they're doing things that are crazy, and we're not addressing it, right, in our society. In fact, many of them are dangerous, right? Um, Jonathan Swift was declared of unsound mind and memory. Brilliant Jonathan Swift, but that was a society where at least people were still factual, and I guess they didn't have the sort of medical facilities, and doctors and psychiatrists who would mask these things, right? They would mask, uh, the reality that, hey, this person is, they've declined, they've entered their dotage, right? So when certain older people, when they're really old, right, they start acting like children again. And those are symptoms, right? Those are symptoms of senility, where they start acting like kids. You see, there's certain things everybody knows. Donald Trump, right? There are things he does, and people compare his intelligence, his mind to a 12-year-old. These are symptoms. I've seen many psychologists, psychiatrists get on TV and make all these comparisons, but yet he's our president, and uh, half of majority of Americans, half of them went in, and at least a plurality of Americans went in and elected him regardless. And here is where we are now, right? Many thousands of people have died. People are losing their lives every day. Innocent kids have been bombed. You even take a look at the cabinet member. Several of his people who work for him, normally you would be able to see that this person is Clinically insane. Again, that's not a term we use anymore. Someone like Stephen Miller. Stephen Miller, when you hear him talk, he says things that are crazy. First of all, they're unconstitutional, factually unsound. They're unsound, right? They're unconstitutional. But if you even look at his temperament on television, he's on television. Typically, you should be selling yourself if you're working, representing the cabinet, but he's openly combative, and this is deemed acceptable. He's confrontational, he's combative, he has no decorum on television, and he actually has a nervous tick. There's this twitch he has. If you notice, it's obvious. I'm like, this guy looks, if you talk about stereotypes, he looks like the sort of person, I mean, his conduct, his behavior is the sort of person that they put in a straitjacket. But these are the people now ruling our nation, the things that they're saying. And why is that so? And that's because Americans have to, grapple, deal with the reality. People view, and Americans probably accept it, a not insignificant amount of our population is crazy, right? And they embrace craziness. It's a baseline. And that's why you have leaders of our government that are obviously non compos mentis, right? In their conduct. They're obviously not, watch their behavior, their mannerisms, right? The things they're saying are left field, completely irrational, right, in their conduct. But they got there, they're right there. So how will historians view Americans? Will they see Americans are a nation of mad people? Right? I don't know. Anyway, I'll keep you posted. Thank you.